Hey there, folks. Welcome to the Jason Wright Show. So, one of the things that I have been hearing about more and more for medicinal use is psychedelics. Ever since about maybe almost 10 years ago, Tim Ferriss really started talking about this and bringing it to the forefront, mainly helping people overcome depression, PTSD, and then also just wanting to get better in touch with who they are. And so, I was first very skeptical. I didn't want to learn anything about psychedelics. I have never done a drug of any kind in my life. And I talk about that in this conversation you're about to listen to with James Eshleman. And I just wanted to finally learn more about it from someone who was an actual guide. And what a guide is someone who actually guides you through the use of psychedelics. That's what James does. So I found this to be a very fascinating conversation. I don't know that I will ever use any form of microdosing, mushrooms, or psychedelics or anything like that. But I think through this conversation, you get a better understanding, I know I did, of exactly what the medicinal uses for psychedelics are. James was very cool, very patient with me in describing the different uses. And I don't know, I think it's just a really cool conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Hey, if you're watching this on the YouTube channel, please consider liking and subscribing and leave some comments, leave some questions for James. Or if you are listening to this on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, whatever it is, Spotify, please leave us a rating and share this with someone that you think might benefit from it. So that's it. Enjoy the conversation and never stop endeavoring to improve always in all ways. Enjoy the show. James Eshleman, welcome to the Jason Wright Show.
Jason, thanks for having me, man.
Well, I'm glad you're here. We're going to be talking about a topic that I'm going to be honest with you. So just let me give you a little bit of my background before we get into your background so that you know kind of who you're dealing with here. So I am a drug virgin. I've never even smoked weed. I've never done anything. And I grew up in a very strict Southern Baptist household where everything, other than alcohol, of course, I mean, we were good Baptists, so we drank, we just pretended like we didn't. And, and so, the concept of any sort of drug was so foreign to me. Fast forward to now, I'm 49 years old. I am completely steeped in health and wellness and also mindfulness. You know, I do a lot of I understand the benefits of meditation and tapping and that sort of thing. And I have a very strong concept of that. But then all of a sudden, I guess for me, uh, I would say it was probably, like I told you, but right before I hit record, maybe a decade ago, I started hearing more and more about psychedelics and their medicinal benefits for helping people with depression, post-traumatic stress syndrome, a lot of different things. I guess the most prominent figure that I first heard about it from was Tim Ferriss, when Tim started doing a lot of research, funding some research at Johns Hopkins with regard to psychedelics. And then the very first time I ever heard Sam Harris on his podcast, they were talking about the benefits of psychedelics and what they can do. But from that time forward, I would say that now I've never done an ayahuasca, session, or I've never done anything. Again, I've never done anything. So you were, like I said before, you're starting at ground zero, dude. I have no concept of any of this. But I am interested in learning more to understand the benefits. So that in particular, if there's a listener out there that wants to explore this further, to overcome some of the struggles they may face with depression and some of these other things that it's been proven to benefit folks with. I want to understand that. So with that complete setup, just to kind of let you know just how ignorant I am to what we're going to be talking about today, I want you to know that so you can literally talk to me like a complete, take whatever's lower than neophyte, that's me, man. So with all that said, let's get started. Tell me about you, your practice, and how this started for you personally.
Yeah. Well, my upbringing kind of feels very similar in a lot of ways to yours. I was, kind of grew up in a traditional household, went to church every Sunday, um, and and began a path towards becoming a businessman. So I studied finance in college, and my first job, the first few jobs out of college were in the finance space. And and I I guess over the course of my life up to that point, I had dealt with depression and anxiety, and uh I also felt just really disconnected from sort of myself. And so I got into psychedelics about 7 years ago, when they were sort of introduced to me at random, and began sitting for myself and to heal my depression and heal things that I struggled with. And and it was sort of through that experience that I began really studying about human growth and development and psychedelics and the mind and um, various different spiritual modalities. And that's really what opened up the door for me to become a psychedelic facilitator about 5 years ago. Since then, I've worked with somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 people in one-to-one psilocybin guided session containers, as well as thousands of others in large group ayahuasca journeys. Um, and, and so my practice, here in Denver has afforded me the opportunity to be a part of a lot of the policy making that happened with the passage of our Prop 122 ballot measure to decriminalize plant medicines and create a legal licensure model here in the state of Colorado.
So, and by the way, spent a lot of time in Denver. My youngest daughter graduated from CU Boulder. So,
Oh, cool.
yeah, so spent a lot of time on Pearl Street and hanging out with the Wooks. And it's love Colorado, and certainly love that Boulder and the whole scene. Which, as you can imagine, for a guy like me, and talk about a fish out of water, but totally love love Boulder and everything there. So, all right, man. So let's unpack some of this. Okay, so I'm going to tell you what like my understanding of the different forms of psychedelics are, because you mentioned with the ballot proposition that you were advocating for, that it was plant-based medicinal psychedelics. So I know mushrooms, psilocybin, which you said, which is basically when we hear acid, is that basically what we're talking about? Is psilocybin?
Acid and psilocybin are two different molecules, but they're operating on the same sort of neural capacity,
Okay,
essentially.
okay,
Yeah,
and then there's ayahuasca.
correct.
Okay, so now let's talk about, because now that you've got, and just tell me about that first time that I guess that you, now whenever, and just to get some definitions of terms, when you say sit, that means a controlled setting where uh you're going to deploy one of these psychedelics for a purpose of whether it's, and you tell me some of the reasons why somebody would do a sit. So that's more of like a guided and kind of a protected place to do it, rather than just being at a party, someone saying, "Here, put this on your tongue and go on a trip," and end up like Don Draper face down in a swimming pool, who knows what's going on, right? So there is a difference then of recreational use and more controlled use. So if I and tell me like the different reasons why, because I know a lot of folks that just, they'll microdose mushrooms kind of randomly for whatever reason. But then I also know that there are some people that are really struggling that look to this as a therapeutic cause. So kind of take us through, just in general terms, why you would do this, what the different scenarios are, and how you facilitate a sitting. Is that the right terminology?
Yeah, yeah. So, I think the iceberg, metaphor here works perfect. Where the tip of the iceberg is sort of the recreational experience. You're going to get the lights, you're going to get the colors. You might even actually get some therapeutic benefit out of it. But then when you step into an intentional space, that's the part of the iceberg that's below the surface. That's where you do the deep intrapersonal work. And you're essentially, it's people come to it for a variety of reasons. And I think it really all distills down to, uh, people are feeling the weight, and the pain of separation, separation from self, separation from others, separation from a higher power, separation from nature. And then what boils up from there is usually, some kind of maybe a mental health condition, whether it's depression, anxiety, um, even complex post traumatic stress disorder can be grouped into that too. So, um, and then there's also, a desire to just sort of commune with, yeah, to commune with and be with the higher power, because that's where the intentional use of psychedelics, um, that's where that really becomes available, and then in sort of that ceremonial space where you invite in a sacred relationship with yourself and with that higher power. Um, and so it looks a variety of ways, and I will call it a sit, I will call it, a ceremony, I'll call it a journey. Each of these forms sort of have a more intentional quality to them. And when I say intentional, it's about the amount of, awareness that you're putting towards, uh, what your intention is stepping into a journey, right? If you really sit and contemplate, um, what is calling to you. Maybe it's you want to heal a relationship with your father, or maybe it's you want to heal your relationship with substances, alcohol, even. Or maybe you are dealing with some trauma that occurred in your childhood, that you want to, release or relate to in a different way. Dialing in what it is that's calling you to that ceremony, to that journey, just the act of beginning to create that awareness of all the components and pieces of, your maybe your psychological disposition, maybe your spiritual disposition, your emotional disposition, creating some granular awareness of those pieces, will help to create that aspect of sort of a sacredness, a sacred intention, meaning that you're going to commune with a deeper part of yourself, and then bring that part of you forth through the journey and the experience itself.
So, okay. So let's talk about the depression aspect of it for a little bit because, like, what does that look like? And from a neurological standpoint, can you kind of help me understand what's going on? Is like my very simple mind on this is, man, is like, well, is it like an extreme relaxation of the amygdala? So you remove all fear. And so is that the opening? That's like once the fear is gone, and then you're able to kind of see into things that kind of like, I guess from a Jungian standpoint, the shadow is kind of it's kind of all of a sudden the shadow you've been suppressing, now all of a sudden it comes full bore and like, man, and again, this is just my ignorance kinda thinking through this. I could see how that could be pretty freaking scary because that could be the dragon all of a sudden unleashed in your mind, and that could be that could be a bad trip, or I could see it being the dragon coming forward and you facing it and realizing that I can conquer this dragon. This dragon that I've kept tame for so long, it's kinda like looking behind the curtain and seeing the Wizard of Oz is really just this little old man with some levers, and it's not all that big, and so now you come out of the journey with that revelation that this dragon I've kept in this cage for so long, I unleashed it, I faced it, and now it can fly away, it can die, whatever the case may be. Is that kind of what's going on? And again, just trying to kinda guess and figure out, am I kinda on to how things work?
Yeah, yeah, and I think, this dragon metaphor is certainly one of the most potent ways to connect to the gift of psychedelics. Um, and I think the benefits of them are operating sort of happening on different levels, right? So with psilocybin, the way that it's working in the brain is, and there's some, kind of some questions around specifics of all of this, but essentially, depression for a long time, the way that it was, uh, thought about was a chemical imbalance within the brain. And that was, it's called chemical imbalance theory. And that was the basis for the prescription of antidepressants, of SSRIs. Um, and what research has begun to show as psilocybin has come onto the scene and we've gotten more skilled at this kind of research is that depression is actually the absence of an optimal neuroplasticity within the brain. And so these SSRIs that people were taking, the, the success rate for SSRIs to treat depression is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 67%. So two-thirds of the population experience some benefit from it. And what they were finding is that a residual effect of the SSRI was that it was creating neuroplasticity in the brain, and that's why it was working. But then there was a large swath of the population who it wasn't working. So then psychedelics come onto the scene and psilocybin comes onto the scene. And psilocybin's primary mechanism within the brain is to create neuroplasticity. Um, and so when the brain is creating optimal neuroplasticity, what that means is simply new neural connections. And you can sort of think about it like if you've ever had depression, it can feel like you've got blinders on or like the walls are closing in, right? Your perspective is sort of narrowed. You're not able to take in as much information. It's a lot easier to get overwhelmed and you kind of want to self isolate or remove yourself. There's that feeling of like wanting to retreat. And I think, the way that I relate to that is that the brain isn't creating enough neural connections to be able to process and take in its environment. And so it's going into sort of this self-preservation mode, protect itself from overwhelm.
Mhm.
And so when you take psilocybin and the new neural connections begin to form, um, particularly within the prefrontal cortex, which is a part of the brain that makes us human, where complex decision making comes from, executive function, mood management, stress management, right? All of these very human specific qualities originate. That part of the brain is now experiencing healthier neural connections. So then, to come back to that blinders metaphor, is that like things start opening back up. One, you're more sensitive to your environment. You're actually taking more information in, but you're also processing it more quickly. So that's what happens on sort of the neurological level. And then when you get to like this sort of more mythic or sort of, you know, mythic level or spiritual level is this, the dragon, the metaphor of the dragon is that we all have these dragons. We, have these sort of parts of us that we have kept hidden and stored away and caged away, because, there has been some pain associated with them, usually something that was too difficult to manage when you were a child, right? And so then this dragon, sort of takes form and it entices or it creates fear in us. And so we keep it at a distance. And I think, what psychedelics do is it allows us to see how we can actually learn to love that dragon and befriend that dragon. Because when you remove the cage and you befriend that dragon, then you have access to the gold that the dragon's protecting. And the gold is the gift that was hidden, that we have kept hidden from us. Because when you get rid of something that is painful in your experience, you also get rid of something that is the gift. It's like you can't have this really rich and robust gift in your life without a little bit of pain, a little bit of discomfort,
Yeah.
right? And so then befriending it makes the gift also accessible. It not only not takes away the pain, but it changes our relationship to the pain and makes a greater gift accessible. And that's a really special facet of it.
I think that is very profound because what it reminds me of is, and because I had an interesting childhood. That's not to say a bad childhood. It was just interesting. And I carried for years a lot of anger toward my biological parents for different reasons. And then like Tony Robbins, he kind of said what you said is that he had a horrible childhood. His mom was, had 3 different dads, whatever. His mom was kind of whatever. But he said, but understanding that he wouldn't be who he is if he hadn't had those bad experiences has made him, such a happier, more joyful person and finding the good. So I could see how, and a lot of people, and I don't know that Tony Robbins has ever used any psychedelics, just bringing him up out of the blue. But, a lot of other folks can't get there without at least some sort of, I would think, an aid to let down those barriers because they might be more intense, more extreme. And so to be able to find that silver lining somewhere may take some sort of an altered state. So talk to me a little bit about the ayahuasca trip. Is and is one of these uh modalities better for a different application than the other? For example, if I'm dealing with childhood trauma, do I need A, B, or C, A, B, and C? Is there a starting point that graduates up to maybe an ayahuasca trip? Or is it and like it so that's trauma, but then if it's depression, it's one thing. If it's PTSD, it's another. Like, how do you decide which modality is most applicable for whatever? And it might be something else. It might just be something like a lot of these billionaires we hear about that go out to Burning Man that are just like, I'm already freaking wicked smart. I've got more, intellectual bandwidth than I'll ever need, but I want to go even further. So bring it on. If there's any barriers, get them out of the way. Let's roll. So, kind of, what are the modalities? Match the modality for me with the desired outcome, and kind of and what that looks like, what the sit looks like, what the how you as a guide, how you help people stay, I guess, I'm just is the word I'm choosing, centered and not go off on a bad trip or something like that. How does all that kinda work?
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, this conversation will always be very individual depending on the person. But generally speaking, I think one of the primary facets of psilocybin is its safety profile and how accessible it is for people who maybe haven't experienced psychedelics before, but are psychedelic curious, maybe want to do some healing, um, but don't, like you said, maybe don't have the ability to drop deeper without it. Um, and psilocybin too is, especially within kind of our Western world right now, um, has a great focus on like the one to one, so the client to the facilitator relationship where you can have a more individual focus on the experience and what you're working through in your experience. And so that touch point I think is really valuable um, from sort of a psychological safety perspective. And then two, the compound itself is relatively safe in terms of the amount of contraindications that it has with um, other pharmaceuticals, um, and uh, and and then on top of that too is sort of the way in which psilocybin creates that neuroplasticity within the brain. I mean, its primary responsibility is to do that. And so then you see in the integration afterward that people with depression who work with psilocybin over the course of twice over the course of 6 months, if they have severe depression, their symptoms may disappear, or will at least get to a degree of remission that is, statistically significant. And then for ayahuasca, it's a bit of a different beast. I shouldn't say beast, bit of a different gift. In that uh, in my experience, in my opinion, the best way to experience ayahuasca is within a group setting. Um, and the reason for that is because each person will bring kind of their own humanness, their own story, their own psychological disposition, emotional disposition, spiritual disposition. And it's sort of this symphony that occurs within the group where, everybody is participating in this sort of collective journey that everybody is having on their own and then also relating to at the same time. And so in my opinion, ayahuasca has a bit more of sort of a deeper spiritual lean to it, where it really allows you to connect to that deeper sense of oneness, or like unitary consciousness, um, and puts you in that place. And so then when you get to that place, it brings about an experience of unconditional love that is really quite significant and quite beautiful. But it's a little bit different to integrate when you have that kind of a spiritual experience and spiritual breakthrough. That it really does force you to come into contact with all the parts that resist that oneness. And so the integration of it can be a little bit more challenging for people, especially people who are maybe psychedelic naive. And so I like to tell people that if you're really psychedelic curious, but you're really maybe you have some hesitation or you're unsure, start with psilocybin first. It's a really great introductory experience to psychedelics. It also is really profound in its capacity to heal. Like it's not to say that it's lesser than ayahuasca. It's very powerful, very potent, but ayahuasca just provides sort of a different experience altogether. And then the integration of an ayahuasca journey can be a bit more complex in a lot of ways.
I want to talk a little bit about something you said that I think is something a lot of people, and maybe it fits in because it came up in what you were just saying. This whole idea of unconditional love, which I think like you mentioned it in passing, but I think that's one of the things that's more profound than people really realize is to be able to truly. And a lot of people throw it around saying, "I love you unconditionally," and most of the people that are saying that are full of shit. They don't love that person conditionally because if the person spit in their eye, cheated on them, whatever, they would no longer love them because they'd be hurt, and that hurt would stand in the way of any love they once had. And unconditional love says, "I'm going to love you no matter what." And so, do you think that what's happening is that whenever you are in this state of just complete openness, so and again, I'm real good. I have to think in analogies. So the barriers are completely gone, and it doesn't mean that doesn't mean you're not conscious of the hurt that, say, an individual has caused you in the past. You just don't give weight to it any longer. It just kind of dissolves. And so now you're just connected with the only thing binding you is your love, no matter what walls of pain and demons are yelling and screaming. It kind of becomes this like channel now of you and the oneness that so that is the conditions for me to love you no longer matter. There is just only me, you, and the love that binds us. Is that kind of the state that it gets you to?
That's a state that it makes accessible, and I think it there's this big aspect of psychedelic work where, it's this practice and technology, I would even call, of surrender, of
Mm,
letting go, and really letting yourself dissolve into an experience. Um, it can happen in spontaneous moments even when you're sober, like sitting and watching a sunset that's just like absolutely breathtaking. There's like, everything just disappears and you're just totally present with something, right? Or maybe it's the gaze of a lover, you looking at them in their eyes and time just sort of disappears and you're just in this deep state of presence. Um and so we all kind of have a like little taste of it along the way, and it's in our capacity to surrender, to let go, that will take us to that place of unconditional love, you know,
mhm.
where we're not present with the pain, we're not present with the hurt. It may be there, but what we're really moved to connect to is that unconditional love, is that feeling of just being perfect as we are. And so yeah, like I think ayahuasca has this capacity to really show us what unconditional love is. And there's a spirit in the plant of ayahuasca that's sort of referred to as grandmother. And it's if you think about sort of the archetypal grandmother, she is unconditionally loving. And sometimes unconditionally loving means that she's going to be hard on you too. She's
Or
going to tell you where you're messing up and where you're doing the wrong thing, but she's also going to give you a dose of love that inspires you to realize, what you're actually capable of. And I think um, that is a part of the beauty of ayahuasca is that it will push you, it will challenge you, it will cause you to confront all the places that you uh, withhold love from yourself and from other people and from your experience. But in doing so, it invites in more of that unconditional love.
I would think that would be one of the scariest parts, to be honest with you. I mean, I like to think that, I try to live a life of forgiveness and, and I do. I mean, I really, and I think I've grown in that way, but I think that's one of the scariest parts is just be able to just release that stuff. That is self-protection, right? I mean, that's what so much of it is that we face. Now, and here's kind of a big kind of cosmic question that you may or may not want to answer. And I don't really have an agenda with it. I'm curious. As a Christian. So I've heard that, this sometimes this comes in complete conflict with the Christian faith. And I'm speaking as a Christian. That's why I'm not talking about Buddhists or Muslim or anything like that. This is just for me, selfish reasons as a believer in Christ. I've heard, that it can bring a closer relationship, kind of the kind of this relationship that we're talking about is like the hurt or whatever things that you have with your relationship with Christ, that sometimes it can be opened up. But then, like, for example, Ben Greenfield, guy that I look up to, I think is a phenomenal human being. He is also a fellow Christian. I know he has, done I think he's been on an ayahuasca trip. I know he's used psilocybin, in microdoses, maybe more, I'm not sure. He's experimented with these things as a believer, and I think if I'm not mistaken, and Ben or anybody from his team, feel free to reach out and correct me, but I think that Ben has now sworn off, using the psychedelics, saying that if you have to use some sort of a mind altering, deal, then maybe you need to work on your relationship with, I guess it could be in his case what he was talking about, Jesus, but it could also be your mom, your dad, whoever you're having a pain with. So I guess all of that to ask, from your perspective, do you think that these psychedelics and a faith, now we can broaden it, a faith of whatever you believe, Christian or otherwise, those 2 things can coexist, and have you seen that? Have you seen that people go in that, like me, the Jump for Jesus guy goes in, goes on an ayahuasca trip, comes out still loving the Lord and, who I am. It's just maybe even, feeling a little more, revived. Kinda what is your take on those 2, the 'cause I can see I could be a collision or a cohesiveness, and honestly, I just don't know enough to be able to say one way or the other what might be the situation there.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting conversation. My experience in the Christian faith, I would go to church and I was always really deeply connected to the hymns,
Mhm.
and parts of the sermon I could connect to as well. But there was always something that was missing for me in that relationship, and um, ever since I've gotten into plant medicine and begun doing my own journeys, I begin to connect to what is termed the Christ consciousness, which is the consciousness that Christ really embodied on the planet and brought to the planet. And and so since then, I actually have a deeper relationship with Christ, not necessarily through the Christian faith, but through this actual knowing and experience of Christ consciousness. And so personally, yeah, it's really transformed for me, my relationship with that faith and with that belief and with the figure that was Jesus Christ, and I actually learned, and felt what it must have been like for to be in his presence, you know, 2000 years ago. That love, that unconditional love, that unconditional acceptance, um, is a lot more available to me now. And then, you also get into really interesting conversations around, like there's the Daime Church out of Brazil, which is a Christian based religion that practices with ayahuasca to commune with Jesus, and so it's really built into their practice of worship and prayer with Jesus Christ. And then there's a great book called The Immortality Key by Brian Marescu, and he is a PhD in the Greek classics. And he did a lot of research into you know essentially the evolution of Eleusis in ancient Greece, which was 300 AD or BC, and it was where all these Greek philosophers would go to sit with ergot, which was essentially an LSD substance that they would, use to help build their intricate philosophies about life. And the story goes that um, essentially, the way that he wrote the book, and I don't necessarily subscribe to this, but it did at least sort of change my mind and allow me to open up my perspective a little bit to or change my relationship with my understanding about the Christian faith. But there was a lot of research that said that it's possible that Jesus Christ got his hands on ergot and was actually serving ergot through the communion. The blood of Christ was this ergot tea that would allow them to commune with God. And so I'm not saying all of that's true. I don't necessarily believe it, but it at least points to a really potent reconsideration of what it actually what these substances can do in terms of allowing us to commune with the higher power. So yeah, I know it's religion and Christianity and psychedelics. It's definitely a very complex conversation, um, and and so I invite in the nuance here, but I think what Ben Greenfield is talking about, that like you know I don't necessarily think that we need to be absolutely prescriptive in terms of how we approach psychedelics, that like psychedelics are the only way to this place. I think, what the substance of what you shared, that is that, I think that our relationships, our primary relationships are really potent experiences for us to actually learn to connect to God. That every person in our life is a mirror for us to learn how we can be in a deeper relationship with Christ, deeper relationship with God, and deeper relationship with ourselves. And I think that when we get to that point, when like society can look at the world and or look at our kind of intimate communities, and then to look at the world as like this is our playground for us to learn how to become better people and not be so dependent on psychedelics for us to heal. That's where I think this whole movement gets really exciting for me.
Man, I love that. And that's one of the things, like you say, that it doesn't have to be this prescriptive, like, okay, if you cannot reach a higher understanding unless use psychedelics. That's kind of like me being kind of the opposite extreme, this uber traditional raising. I want to be able to not be dogmatic about anything, but to be able to be open to understanding all these amazing experiences, modalities, and methodologies for being what you just said, a better human. I mean, the motto of this podcast is to improve always in all ways. And that's why I want to have these sorts of conversations. And one of the things you just touched on there is something that probably I didn't really get to, and it will be until the day I leave this world, a journey, I'm sure. But when I was 40, I really started trying to truly understand and get comfortable with who I am, the good, the bad, the ugly, the shadow that I've been suppressing, letting that kind of come forward a little bit, either deal with it or let it shine. Either try to just feel like, what role is it playing? Is it an antagonist or what, or a protagonist? And that's what I want to talk a little bit about now is, how have you seen psychedelics help? And not in just some simplified, contrite, well, someone was an introvert and they used psychedelics and they came out, now they're bold type A and they're just the leader they never thought they were. But rather someone who has basically lived with like shame, fear, extreme lack of confidence, and then they're able to not just do the silly navel gazing, kind of that surface level self-love that gets kind of thrown around, I think, a little too little too easily these days, but truly a true inward reflection, and go deep and go and understand everything within oneself, and then come back either accepting or willing to deal with those things that you refuse to accept. Kinda how have you seen that come to play as a result of psychedelics?
Mm. Yeah, I think this conversation is like the dance between like the victim and the empowered living,
Yeah.
you know? and the technologies that it takes to get from the victim to the empowered living, whether you're looking at it like the protagonist or the antagonist,
Mhm.
and and learning how to be with the content of your life. Like it's really interesting when you move away from a way of being in the world where you're just sort of going through the motions and living this prescriptive lifestyle. Like I go to college, I get a job, I get married, I have kids, I live in a house, and then all of a sudden, 40 years down the road, you're like, what am I doing? Like, why am I
Yeah.
here?
I'm
Like,
in the matrix and I don't even know how I got here.
yeah, yeah. And I think, to break free from that is to, begin to look at your life as a curriculum, that every piece of your life, whatever the content of your life is, maybe it's a shitty relationship that you have with, your partner, or maybe it's maybe it is that you're in a job that is paying the bills, but it doesn't feel fulfilling. Like each one of these little pieces are their content for us to learn what our curriculum is in life. Ultimately, for us to reach this place of unconditional love, to get to this place where we are embracing, you know, and being empowered by the challenges that we face, the trials and tribulations. Um, it's all I think it's a really interesting thing that happens to the human spirit when we stop taking away our own power and stop, you know, reducing our experience to this thing happened to me, but and shift into this thing is happening for me, to open up my heart more, to open up to a greater sense of richness in my life, to deepen my relationships, to become more purposeful, to even experience greater sense of aliveness, just to wake up in the morning and be like, like what is possible for me today? You know, that is such a great feeling. And so I think that's, a really big part of it.
I think you are spot on. And I also think kind of a converse of that is too, is like to get people away from this idea of the only to overcome my victimhood or bad feelings, I gotta go buy some more crap. I gotta go get a fancy car. I've gotta go get, I've gotta go do something to impress people, which then again only lends to the things. The only way I can be happy inside is to make the outside world better, either like by throwing out, some, what it by a flex, but with my car, my clothes, my watch, whatever, as opposed to going deep within inside. And that's one of the things, and that's why I love about this conversation is because I have become obsessed with experience. My wife and I talk about it all the time. We live a very modest life. And I know that's relative to, I know it's a very relative term, but we try to really base our life on experiences and truly being. And I think that one of the things that you said, I think is probably more powerful than is to and I think heard this right. Live with the content of our life. Is that what you said? Yeah.
Yeah.
To be able to know that we all have this content of our environment, our relationships, our friendships. Okay. And identifying that content and then do what you just said, kind of like the Viktor Frankl of every moment is happening with reason. There is a purpose in man's search for meaning. This whole context, right? Is there is a reason this happens, not just the universe being pissed off and trying to kick me in the nuts. No, there is something to be learned and taught. And I like what you said too about the fact that live life as though it's curriculum. We're just getting better each and every day. And then you don't get so obsessed with the why did this happen? Why no, this just that's the quiz that came before me today. So there's a lot of wisdom in that, man. That's really profound.
Yeah. Yeah. And then it becomes a dance.
Mhm.
You sort of lay down like this, this need to accomplish, this need to strive, this need to do the right thing, this need to, um, set yourself apart, and it just becomes this experience of you being in your body, you know and you breathing deeply and you taking in the experience of today in its fullness, whether good or bad, and just learning how to let it open you up to more of who you are, because then in bringing more of who you are into your day to day and stretch that over the course of time, that's where the success happens. That's where the really deep relationships come into your life. That's where, money starts flowing into your life, and it's all happening from a place of easeful grace and awareness of our relationship to our environment and our environment's relationship to us. And on top of that too, I think it's like it invites in a path of service, you know, to be in service to other people. Because when you're not so caught up in yourself and in your own issues, then you get to step out into the world and you get to serve others and
100%.
help, relieve the pain and suffering on the planet. And I think to me, there's almost nothing more juicy than that.
Yeah, I love that 100%. Now, I know we've got a time crunch here, but before you go, I got to ask. So I fly out to Denver, I meet up with you, and I decide that I want to do a sit just for the listener. What does that look like? From a tactical standpoint, what's the kind of the prerequisites beforehand, if there are any, and then take me through what that whole experience is going to look like.
Yeah, so I run everybody through a consultation, and kind of get a sense of their psycho spiritual history, a little bit of their story, and what they're bringing into the experience. I also want to know a bit about their medical history, what prescriptions they might be on right now, and I also want to make sure that they have the right support when they come back into their own environment, that they can feel supported in making the changes that they feel called to make through the experience. So that's a consultation. And then if everything checks out, that's where we'll move into sort of setting up this preparation and integration process. So I lead everybody through preparation sessions where we go a little bit deeper into the content of somebody's life and begin to make sense and make meaning of why, you're being called to the medicine now. What's it all about? And how is, your experience with psilocybin going to help aid you in coming into a better relationship with that content? And then that's about a 2-week process. And then we kind of, go into the journey, and the journey is about a 6 to 8 hour experience. And then from there we step into integration, and that's sort of spaced out. There's 3 integration sessions that I do over the course of about 4 weeks. And um, the sessions that I do, aside from the journey, are all done via Zoom, and then obviously the journey is done in person.
Do you work in concert sometimes with counselors and psychiatrists, or like if someone's going to counseling and their counselor says, "Hey, this might be something to help you overcome the trauma you have from your relationship with your father or whatever," and they go out to see you, and then they go back and they continue to do the work, like whatever you help them bring forward through the psychedelic experience, and they come back and they explain it to the counselor. Do you do some of that work?
Yeah, I love collaborating with people who have intimate relationships with these people, with these clients. I think it's just this really beautiful orchestra of support. That definitely can deepen the experience, uh, and just to keep everybody sort of in the loop of everything as well. But yeah, so that collaboration piece is a lot of fun for me.
Well, James, this has been awesome, dude. I told you that you were starting with ground zero. Thank you for being patient with me. I hope that my questions didn't make your hair want to catch on fire. You have to go like drop some acid just to get over this
Uh,
ridiculous station. hopefully, hopefully it was a good experience.
No, man, it was great. I love starting from scratch because it sort of feels like that springtime energy. There's like a vitality to the conversation and the curiosity, and I really appreciated where we started from.
Awesome, brother. Well, how can people follow you, reach you if someone heard this and they want to dig a little deeper? How do they get in touch with you, man?
Yeah, I'm on the internet. My website is centerofalldirections.com, and my Instagram handle is at James Eshleman, all one word.
Very good. I'll have that in the show notes as well. James, this has been fun, man. You definitely gave me an education, brother. I appreciate it. And the next time I'm out in Denver, whatever I'm not saying I'm ready to go on a trip with you, but love to maybe it's just some really strong coffee and give and hug it out and say and meet you in person, brother. So maybe we'll make that happen.
All in, man. Would love that.
All right, brother. Thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate you. Hey, folks, thanks for joining us. He's James. I'm Jason, and we are out. Well, that does it for this episode of The Jason Wright Show. Thank you so much for listening. This has been a Texas Titan Media production. Fourth Wall did the music. And as always, thank you so much for listening. Please consider going out to jasonwrightnow.com and signing up for the Vitruvian letter. Also, please go out to iTunes. It takes like 30 seconds to just leave us a 5-star rating. It does wonders for the podcast. I would be so grateful. And with that, until we meet again, go crush it and endeavor to improve always in all ways. I'm out.